Throughout history, wars have been won and lost not just by superior forces or better weapons, but by decisions, sometimes brilliant, often catastrophic. Then there were these military leaders who proved that commanding an army doesn't mean you know how to use one, and that the most devastating weapon in warfare is often incompetent leadership, making decisions that defy logic, ignore intelligence, and cost thousands of lives. Buckle up for a masterclass in how not to wage war, featuring blunders that changed the world forever. 1. In 1942, Adolf Hitler made what many historians consider the worst military decision in modern history by ordering the German Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad at all costs instead of allowing a strategic retreat. Despite being surrounded by Soviet forces and facing certain destruction, Hitler refused to permit withdrawal, insisting the army fight to the last man for a city of symbolic rather than strategic importance. For months, German soldiers froze and starved, while Hitler demanded they hold positions that served no military purpose. The eventual surrender of 91,000 German soldiers marked the first time a German field marshal had ever surrendered and became the turning point of World War II in Europe. The destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad cost Germany its best troops and most experienced commanders, beginning an irreversible decline that ended in Berlin 3 years later. 2. In 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led 210 men of the 7th Cavalry into the Battle of Little Bighorn against what he believed was a small Native American encampment. Custer had divided his forces, ignored intelligence reports about enemy strength, refused additional troops and Gatling guns offered before the campaign, and attacked without reconnaissance. He rode directly into a combined force of approximately 2,000 Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, the largest gathering of Plains Indians ever assembled. Within an hour, Custer and every man with him were dead. Custer's last stand became synonymous with military arrogance and remains the most famous defeat in American military history, directly caused by a commander who believed his reputation made him invincible. 3. In 1916, British commanders ordered the first day of the Battle of the Somme, sending 100,000 soldiers walking slowly toward German machine gun positions in broad daylight because they believed artillery bombardment had destroyed enemy defenses. The bombardment had failed to cut German barbed wire or destroy fortified positions, but commanders ordered the attack anyway. British soldiers were told to walk rather than run, because commanders believed the Germans were already dead and running might disorder the advance. By nightfall, 57,170 British soldiers had been killed or wounded, the bloodiest single day in British military history. The battle continued for 4 more months, eventually claiming over 1 million casualties on both sides for a maximum advance of 6 miles. 4. In 1941, Joseph Stalin ignored over 80 separate intelligence warnings that Nazi Germany was preparing to invade the Soviet Union, including the exact date of the attack. Stalin was so convinced Hitler wouldn't break their non-aggression pact that he had officers who reported German preparations arrested or executed for spreading panic. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, Soviet forces were completely unprepared despite months of obvious German buildup. In the first weeks, the Soviets lost millions of soldiers and thousands of aircraft, many destroyed on the ground. Stalin's refusal to accept intelligence that contradicted his assumptions nearly cost the Soviet Union the war and contributed to the deaths of over 27 million Soviet citizens. 5. In 1836, Mexican General Santa Anna's decision to take an afternoon siesta with his entire army during the Texas Revolution cost Mexico half its territory. After defeating the Texans at the Alamo, Santa Anna pursued the retreating Texan army to San Jacinto, where he inexplicably ordered his troops to rest in the early afternoon without posting adequate guards. Sam Houston's Texan force attacked during the siesta, achieving complete surprise against an army that was literally sleeping. The Battle of San Jacinto lasted just 18 minutes, with Mexican forces suffering over 600 killed and Santa Anna himself captured the next day. The defeat led directly to Texas independence, and eventually American annexation of territory that would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of several other states. 6. In 1940, French military planners concentrated their best forces along the Maginot Line, an expensive fortification system designed to prevent German invasion. Then watched as German forces simply drove around it through Belgium and the Ardennes forest, which the French had deemed impassable to armor. The Maginot Line represented the French military's complete misunderstanding of modern mobile warfare, and their concentration of forces in the wrong locations left them unable to respond when German panzers appeared where they weren't expected. France fell in just 6 weeks, and the Maginot Line became history's most famous example of preparing to fight the last war instead of the next one. 7. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia with over 600,000 soldiers, the largest army ever assembled in European history to that point. Despite warnings from his own generals about the dangers of a Russian campaign, Napoleon pushed deep into Russian territory, expecting a decisive battle that never came. The Russians retreated, burning everything behind them, denying Napoleon the supplies and the battle he needed. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found it abandoned and burning. His subsequent retreat through the Russian winter became one of history's greatest military disasters, with fewer than 100,000 soldiers surviving the campaign. The destruction of the Grande Armée ended French dominance of Europe and marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. 8. In 1281, Mongol ruler Kublai Khan sent a massive invasion fleet of over 4,000 ships and 140,000 soldiers to conquer Japan for the second time. Despite the first invasion attempt failing 7 years earlier due to a typhoon, Kublai Khan's commanders made no provisions for weather protection and anchored the massive fleet in a vulnerable location. When another typhoon struck, later called kamikaze or divine wind by the Japanese, the fleet was devastated. Over 100,000 Mongol soldiers drowned, and the invasion was completely destroyed. The failure ended Mongol expansion into Japan forever, and created the Japanese concept of divine protection that would influence their military thinking for centuries. 9. In 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee ordered Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, sending 2,500 soldiers across nearly a mile of open ground directly into concentrated Union artillery and rifle fire. Lee's subordinate, General James Longstreet, opposed the attack so strongly he couldn't verbally give the order, merely nodding when asked if the charge should proceed. The assault was a disaster, with Confederate forces suffering nearly 50% casualties in less than an hour. The defeat at Gettysburg marked the turning point of the American Civil War, and Lee's decision to order a frontal assault against fortified positions became a textbook example of command failure and the limitations of offensive warfare against modern weapons. 10. In 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet sailed 18,000 miles around the world to fight Japan in the Battle of Tsushima, arriving exhausted with fouled hulls and demoralized crews. The voyage had taken 7 months, during which the fleet had accidentally fired on British fishing boats, nearly causing a war with Britain, and had struggled to find ports willing to provide coal. When they finally reached Japanese waters, the fleet was destroyed in just 2 days, losing all 8 battleships and suffering over 10,000 casualties against Japanese losses of 3 torpedo boats. The defeat contributed to the Russian Revolution of 1905 and demonstrated that sending a fleet around the world to fight a prepared enemy was perhaps not the best strategy. 11. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar ignored multiple warnings about a conspiracy against him, including specific intelligence identifying the conspirators and the date of the planned assassination. His wife Calpurnia's dreams of his death troubled him enough that he nearly stayed home on the Ides of March, but a conspirator convinced him to attend the Senate anyway. Caesar's dismissal of security concerns and confidence in his own invincibility led directly to his assassination, and plunged Rome into years of civil war that ultimately ended the Roman Republic. His famous last words, "Et tu, Brute," have become synonymous with betrayal ignored. 12. In 1941, American commanders at Pearl Harbor ignored multiple warnings of an imminent Japanese attack, including radar detection of incoming aircraft that was dismissed as a scheduled flight of American bombers. Despite increasing tensions with Japan and specific warnings from Washington about possible attacks, the Pacific Fleet remained anchored in rows perfect for attack. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage rather than air attack, and anti-aircraft ammunition remained locked in storage. The Japanese attack killed 2,403 Americans and destroyed or damaged 19 ships and nearly 200 aircraft. The disaster could have been far worse if the aircraft carriers had been in port, but the failure to prepare despite warnings remains one of history's greatest intelligence failures. 13. In 1940, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini invaded Greece without informing his German ally Hitler, expecting an easy victory over a small nation. The invasion began in late October, despite approaching winter weather in a mountainous terrain, without adequate supplies, winter clothing, or realistic assessment of Greek military capability. Greek forces not only stopped the Italian invasion, but pushed them back into Albania, humiliating Mussolini. Germany was forced to divert forces to rescue their Italian ally, delaying Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, by crucial weeks. Some historians argue this delay meant German forces reached Moscow just as winter set in, potentially changing the entire outcome of World War II. 14. In 1815, French Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy received orders to pursue the retreating Prussian army after the Battle of Ligny. On June 18th, Grouchy heard the sounds of cannon fire from Waterloo, where Napoleon was engaged with Wellington's forces, but decided to continue following his original orders rather than march to the sound of the guns. His subordinates pleaded with him to change direction, but Grouchy insisted on obeying his orders literally. While Grouchy chased Prussians who weren't where he was looking, the Prussian army under Blücher arrived at Waterloo and attacked Napoleon's flank, deciding the battle. Napoleon's 100 days ended because a marshal followed orders instead of responding to the reality of battle. 15. In 1279, the Song dynasty of China made its last stand at the naval battle of Yamen against the Mongol Yuan dynasty. With over 1,000 ships and 200,000 people, including soldiers, officials, and civilians, the Song fleet had numerical superiority, but their commander made the catastrophic decision to chain the ships together for stability, preventing maneuvering. When the Mongols attacked with fire ships, the chained fleet couldn't disperse. The resulting disaster killed over 100,000 people, including the last Song emperor, a boy of 8 who drowned when a court official jumped into the sea with him rather than face capture. The battle ended the Song dynasty and completed the Mongol conquest of China. 16. In 1914, Russian commanders at Tannenberg ordered 2 armies to advance into East Prussia while communicating their plans over uncoded radio transmissions that German forces intercepted. The Germans knew exactly where both Russian armies were and where they intended to go, allowing them to concentrate forces against each army separately. The Russian Second Army was encircled and destroyed, with 78,000 soldiers taken prisoner and the commanding general committing suicide. The disaster at Tannenberg knocked Russia back on its heels and established the Eastern Front pattern of German superiority that continued until the revolution ended Russian participation in the war. 17. In 1836, Texan commander James Fannin ignored Sam Houston's orders to retreat from Goliad after the fall of the Alamo. Fannin delayed for days, first to rescue other units, then waiting for oxen to move artillery, then simply hesitating while Mexican forces closed in. When he finally retreated, his force was caught in open prairie by Mexican cavalry and forced to surrender. Despite promises of fair treatment, Santa Anna ordered all 342 prisoners executed in what became known as the Goliad Massacre. The massacre, caused directly by Fannin's indecision and failure to follow orders, became a rallying cry alongside "Remember the Alamo" that motivated Texan forces at San Jacinto. 18. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed to invade England with 130 ships carrying 30,000 men. The plan required precise coordination with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, but communication was poor, and the Duke of Parma's army wasn't ready when the Armada arrived. English fire ships scattered the Spanish fleet at anchor, and subsequent battles damaged Spanish ships, while English vessels remained largely intact due to their superior maneuverability. The Armada's commander then made the fatal decision to return to Spain by sailing around Scotland and Ireland, rather than through the English Channel. Storms wrecked dozens of ships on the rocky coasts, and fewer than half the Armada's ships returned to Spain. The defeat ended Spanish plans to invade England and marked the beginning of Spain's decline as Europe's dominant power. 19. In 1942, Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo hesitated fatally during the Battle of Midway, repeatedly changing the armament on his aircraft between bombs and torpedoes, as conflicting reports came in about American forces. When American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers, the flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed, aviation fuel lines were exposed, and bombs and torpedoes littered the decks. In just 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were turned into burning wrecks. A 4th was sunk later that day. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced pilots shifted the balance of Pacific power permanently. Nagumo's indecision during those crucial morning hours cost Japan the war. 20. In 1415, French commanders at Agincourt chose to attack an English army half their size across a muddy, narrow field that neutralized their numerical advantage. Despite advice to wait and let the English starve, French nobles insisted on immediate attack to claim glory. Heavily armored French knights trudged through deep mud toward English longbowmen, who had sharpened stakes protecting their positions. The exhausted French were slaughtered by arrows and then by English men-at-arms. Over 6,000 French soldiers died, including many of the highest nobility, against English losses of perhaps 400. The battle demonstrated that feudal chivalry and noble enthusiasm were no match for disciplined infantry with ranged weapons. 21. In 1943, Hitler overruled his generals and ordered the offensive at Kursk, despite knowing that the Soviets had been building massive defensive fortifications for months after intelligence revealed German plans. The Germans attacked directly into the most heavily fortified positions in military history, with Soviet defenses up to 150 miles deep. The resulting battle was the largest tank engagement in history, and despite initial gains, German forces were stopped cold by prepared defenses. The failure at Kursk consumed Germany's last strategic armored reserves and permanently transferred the initiative on the Eastern Front to the Soviet Union. Germany would never launch another major offensive in the East. 22. In 1879, British commander Lord Chelmsford split his forces during the Zulu War and left 1,800 men at Isandlwana, while he pursued what he believed was the main Zulu army. The main Zulu force of 20,000 warriors was actually concealed near the camp, and they attacked the divided British force at noon. The camp fell within hours, with over 1,300 British soldiers and African auxiliaries killed. It was the worst defeat of British forces by indigenous enemies in history. The disaster resulted from Chelmsford's failure to form a proper defensive position, his division of forces, and his underestimation of Zulu military capability, despite specific warnings. 23. In 1453, Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX failed to secure adequate Western military assistance before the Ottoman siege of Constantinople, despite years of warning about Ottoman intentions. When Sultan Mehmed II finally besieged the city, Constantine had only about 7,000 defenders against an Ottoman army of 80,000. Despite this, Constantinople's massive walls held for nearly 2 months until someone left a small gate called the Kirka Porta, unlocked after a sortie. Ottoman troops discovered the open gate and poured through, taking the city and ending the Byzantine Empire after over 1,000 years. The fall of Constantinople reshaped the world, driving scholars westward and contributing to the Renaissance while establishing Ottoman control over the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. 24. In 1863, Union General Ambrose Burnside ordered repeated frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions at Fredericksburg, sending wave after wave of soldiers to certain death against a stone wall defended by Confederate infantry. Despite watching earlier attacks fail with horrific casualties, Burnside continued ordering assaults because he believed eventual success would come through persistence. After 14 separate charges, Union forces had suffered over 12,000 casualties without gaining any ground. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, watching the slaughter, commented, "It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it." Burnside was relieved of command, and his name became synonymous with incompetent generalship. 25. In 480 BC, Persian King Xerxes trusted a Greek trader named Ephialtes, who revealed a mountain path around the Greek defensive position at Thermopylae. However, the delay caused by the 3-day battle, including the famous last stand of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, gave Greece time to prepare its naval forces and evacuate Athens. Xerxes' subsequent decision to attack the Greek fleet in the narrow waters of Salamis, where Persian numerical advantage was negated, resulted in the destruction of his naval forces. Unable to supply his massive army by sea, Xerxes withdrew most of his forces, and the remaining Persian army was defeated at Plataea. The failure to quickly bypass Thermopylae and the tactical error at Salamis cost Persia its chance to conquer Greece. 26. In 1854, a miscommunicated order during the Crimean War sent the British Light Brigade charging directly into Russian artillery in the Valley of Death. The order had intended a different objective, but Lord Cardigan, who despised the officer delivering the order, chose to interpret it literally rather than question its apparent insanity. 670 cavalrymen charged into massed Russian cannon fire with barely a third returning. The charge accomplished nothing militarily but became famous through Tennyson's poem as a symbol of brave futility and the danger of blind obedience to clearly suicidal orders. The officers responsible for the disaster blamed each other for the rest of their lives. 27. In 1914, German General Alexander von Kluck violated the Schlieffen Plan during the invasion of France, turning his army to pursue retreating French forces rather than sweeping west of Paris as originally planned. This exposed his flank to French and British forces, leading to the First Battle of the Marne where Allied counterattacks halted the German advance. The War of Movement ended, and both sides dug trenches that would stretch from Switzerland to the sea. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan meant Germany would fight the two-front war it had desperately tried to avoid, leading to 4 years of bloody stalemate and ultimately German defeat. 28. In 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, despite having no obligation to do so under the tripartite pact with Japan. The United States had been focused on Japan after Pearl Harbor, and there was significant public pressure to prioritize the Pacific War. Hitler's declaration allowed President Roosevelt to pursue a Germany-first strategy that he might not have achieved otherwise. By bringing the full industrial and military might of the United States into the European war, Hitler ensured his own destruction. Some historians consider this unprovoked declaration of war Hitler's greatest strategic blunder of the entire conflict. 29. In 1942, British General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore and 80,000 soldiers to a Japanese force half that size, making it the largest British surrender in history. Despite having numerical superiority and fortified positions, Percival believed Japanese propaganda about enemy strength and worried about water supplies after Japanese forces captured reservoirs. Japanese General Yamashita was actually nearly out of ammunition and had bluffed about his strength. Winston Churchill called the surrender the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The fall of Singapore shattered the myth of British military superiority and permanently damaged British prestige in Asia. 30. In 1532, Incan Emperor Atahualpa agreed to meet Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro at Cajamarca, despite having an army of 80,000 warriors against fewer than 200 Spaniards. Atahualpa believed his overwhelming numbers made him invincible, and came to the meeting unarmed with thousands of courtiers rather than soldiers. Pizarro's men, hiding in surrounding buildings, ambushed the Incans with cannon, cavalry, and steel weapons. In 2 hours of slaughter, Spanish forces killed thousands of Incans without losing a single man and captured Atahualpa. The emperor's ransom in gold and silver didn't save him. He was executed the following year. The capture of Atahualpa effectively ended the Incan Empire and enabled Spanish conquest of South America. 31. In 1916, the German Navy sailed its high seas fleet into the Battle of Jutland, expecting to trap and destroy a portion of the British Grand Fleet. Instead, they encountered the entire British force. Though the Germans inflicted heavier losses in the ensuing battle, they fled back to port and never again seriously challenged British naval supremacy. Admiral Scheer, commanding the German fleet, admitted that Germany could not win a fleet action against Britain. The fleet remained in port for most of the remaining war, and its inactivity contributed to the mutinies that ended the German monarchy in 1918. Germany's most expensive military investment spent the war doing essentially nothing. 32. In 1879, the Prince Imperial of France Louis Napoleon, heir to the French throne and serving with British forces in South Africa, was killed by Zulus during a patrol because his commanding officer, Lieutenant Jalil Carey, fled without him when they were ambushed. The patrol had stopped to rest in an area with poor visibility against standing orders, and when Zulus attacked, Carey and the other soldiers rode away, while Louis struggled with his horse. His death caused a diplomatic crisis between Britain and France, ended the Bonaparte dynasty, and destroyed Carey's career. The prince died because a patrol broke rules and its leader abandoned him. 33. In 1942, the Canadian raid on Dieppe resulted in 68% casualties among the attacking force because planners underestimated German defenses and the assault lacked adequate fire support. Intelligence about German positions was poor, tanks couldn't climb the seawall, and naval bombardment was inadequate. Of 6,086 men who landed, 3,623 were killed, wounded, or captured. While later claimed as a lesson for D-Day planning, Dieppe was fundamentally a poorly planned disaster that sacrificed Canadian soldiers for intelligence that could have been gathered through other means. The raid accomplished nothing militarily except killing Commonwealth troops. 34. In 1879, British forces invading Afghanistan occupied Kabul but underestimated Afghan resistance. When the British envoy attempted to negotiate withdrawal, he was murdered, and the retreating column of 6,500 soldiers and civilians was harassed through mountain passes in winter. Only one European, Dr. William Bryden, reached the safety of Jalalabad, though some soldiers and camp followers survived as prisoners. The destruction of an entire army in Afghanistan became a warning about the dangers of occupying that country that would be ignored by the Soviets in 1979 and by the Americans after 2001. 35. In 1805, the combined French and Spanish fleet at Trafalgar could have avoided battle by remaining in port, but Napoleon pressured Admiral Villeneuve to put to sea despite knowing the British fleet was waiting. Nelson's aggressive tactics broke the combined fleet's line and destroyed it as a fighting force, killing or capturing 22 ships without losing one British vessel. Villeneuve was captured and later died under suspicious circumstances. Trafalgar ended any possibility of Napoleon invading Britain and established British naval supremacy for over a century. Napoleon's insistence on forcing a battle his admirals knew they couldn't win cost France control of the seas. 36. In 331 BC, Persian King Darius III fled the Battle of Gaugamela, while outcome remained undecided, causing his army to collapse despite significantly outnumbering Alexander the Great's forces. Darius had chosen the battlefield, prepared it for his chariots, and assembled an army possibly 5 times larger than Alexander's. But when Alexander's cavalry threatened to break through to his position, Darius fled rather than fight, just as he had at the previous Battle of Issus. His flight demoralized his army, and the greatest empire in the world fell because its king ran from battle twice. 37. In 1950, American General Douglas MacArthur ignored Chinese warnings and pushed UN forces toward the Yalu River, dismissing intelligence reports of massive Chinese troop concentrations in Korea. MacArthur assured President Truman that China wouldn't intervene and that the war would be over by Christmas. When 300,000 Chinese soldiers attacked in November, UN forces were caught completely by surprise and driven back in one of the longest retreats in American military history. The Korean War continued for 3 more years, and MacArthur's dismissal for publicly contradicting administration policy became a landmark in civil-military relations. 38. In 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser expelled UN peacekeepers from the Sinai, closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, and massed troops on Israel's border while publicly threatening Israel's destruction. Rather than waiting for an attack, Israel launched a preemptive strike that destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in hours. The 6-day war that followed saw Israel capture the Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, and Golan Heights. Nasser's aggressive posturing had provoked exactly the war Egypt wasn't prepared to fight, and resulted in territorial losses that shaped Middle Eastern politics for decades. 39. In 1940, Hitler halted German armored forces outside Dunkirk for 3 days, allowing the evacuation of over 330,000 Allied soldiers who would otherwise have been captured or killed. Hitler's reasons remain debated. He may have believed Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could destroy the pocket, or he may have wanted to preserve tanks for operations elsewhere. Whatever the reason, the miracle of Dunkirk saved the core of the British Army to fight again. Churchill later called the returning soldiers the whole root and core and brain of the British Army. Without the halt order, Britain might have been forced to negotiate peace. 40. In 1864, Confederate General John Bell Hood destroyed his own army through repeated frontal assaults at Franklin and Nashville. At Franklin, Hood ordered a charge across 2 miles of open ground against entrenched Union forces, resulting in 6,000 Confederate casualties in 5 hours, including 6 generals killed. 2 weeks later at Nashville, his weakened army was routed by Union forces and essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. Hood's aggressive tactics, which might have worked earlier in the war, were suicidal against prepared positions with modern weapons. He destroyed the last major Confederate force in the Western Theater through sheer stubbornness. 41. In 1592, Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi invaded Korea with 158,000 soldiers as the first step in a planned conquest of China. Initial success stalled when Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin destroyed Japanese supply lines with his innovative turtle ships, cutting off the invasion force from reinforcement and supply. Hideyoshi had completely neglected naval preparation, despite Korea being accessible primarily by sea. The invasion collapsed, and a second attempt in 1597 also failed. Hideyoshi died in 1598, and Japan abandoned continental ambitions for over 300 years. The failure demonstrated that even overwhelming land forces are useless without secure supply lines. 42. In 1066, English King Harold Godwinson force-marched his army south immediately after defeating a Norwegian invasion at Stamford Bridge, giving his exhausted soldiers no rest before confronting William of Normandy at Hastings. Harold might have waited for reinforcements or allowed his army to recover, but chose immediate battle. His tired infantry held strong positions all day, but were eventually drawn out by Norman feigned retreats. Harold was killed, reportedly by an arrow to the eye, and England fell to Norman rule. The Battle of Hastings changed English history forever, because a king wouldn't give his army a few days' rest. 43. In 1942, American Admiral William Halsey was lured away from the Battle of Leyte Gulf by a Japanese decoy fleet, leaving the landing beaches virtually unprotected. The Japanese plan worked perfectly. Halsey chased empty carriers north, while the powerful Japanese center force nearly reached the beaches where it could have destroyed the invasion fleet. Only the suicidal courage of American escort carrier crews, who attacked Japanese battleships with destroyers and aircraft, saved the invasion. Halsey's failure to leave adequate protection while pursuing a decoy nearly lost the largest naval battle in history. 44. In 1961, the CIA-backed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs failed catastrophically because President Kennedy withdrew promised air support at the last minute, fearing international criticism. The invasion plan depended on air superiority to destroy Castro's air force and protect the landing force. Without it, Cuban aircraft strafed the beaches and sank supply ships. Of 1,400 invaders, over 1,100 were captured. The failure embarrassed the United States, strengthened Castro's position, and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, contributing directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. 45. And finally, in 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered World War I, partly because Austrian Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf had been advocating for war with Serbia for years, and saw the assassination as his opportunity. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum designed to be rejected, then declared war despite Serbia accepting nearly all demands. What followed was a cascade of alliance obligations that pulled all of Europe into war. Conrad's war against Serbia went badly from the start. Austrian forces were repeatedly defeated and had to be rescued by Germany. The war Conrad wanted destroyed the empire he served. Austria-Hungary collapsed in 1918, and Conrad's aggressive advocacy for a war his military couldn't win resulted in the death of an empire that had lasted over 600 years, the deaths of millions of soldiers, and a peace settlement that would lead to an even deadlier war just 20 years later. The war that began with Conrad's eagerness to fight ended with everything he fought for obliterated from the map. Here's the brutal truth about military leadership. History is filled with commanders who had every advantage and threw it away through arrogance, incompetence, or inability to adapt. These blunders prove that superior numbers, better weapons, and strategic position mean nothing when leadership fails, and that the most dangerous enemy is often wearing the same uniform. The real battlefield was the decision-making they massacred along the way. Every blunder in this list cost lives that didn't need to be lost, changed borders that didn't need to change, and proved that the worst casualty in war is often common sense. History's lesson is clear. Military genius is rare, but military stupidity is common. And the difference between victory and catastrophe often comes down to a single decision made by a single commander who was too arrogant, too stubborn, or too incompetent to see what everyone else could see clearly. Subscribe if you appreciate commanders who don't get their soldiers killed through obvious stupidity. And remember that the most successful military leaders in history often won not by being brilliant, but simply by being less incompetent than their opponents.